But the clinician's impact of that is education. What do I do and how do I learn this? And if you introduce multiple types of chest tubes, IV catheters, central lines to a hospital, and you don't have a training behind it, you're going to start having serious quality issues. And in addition to a frustrated clinical team. But the financials of it may say, you're saving money because you're driving widget for widget substitution, a widget for widget better pricing, or insert here.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
Matt Mentel, founder and strategic partner at Strategic Optimization and Innovation Partners, LLC, joins us today to talk about don't make assumptions. There's been a lot of change and a lot more awareness of healthcare supply chain. How are we going to make sure that our stakeholders and leadership really fully comprehend what supply chain's role is in our healthcare organizations, while at the same time not encumbering them with a whole lengthy explanation and really hitting on the key areas, Hayes? I'm excited to talk to Matt today. He's going to be an excellent guest.
Justin, I like what you just did there. That was impressive, but you need to stick around and listen to what Matt has to say about basically providing cliff notes for your C-suite and everybody else. So stick around and enjoy. He did a great job.
All right, we're going to be right back with Matt Mentel. Stay with us.
Boom! I'm Hayes Walder.
This is Gary Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Power Supply.
Speaking with us today is Matt Mentel, founder and strategic partner at Strategic Optimization and Innovation Partners, LLC. And Matt, we are going to be talking about how to ensure that your stakeholders and leadership fully comprehend supply chain's role. We know there's a great deal of increased awareness these days. I think the sensitivities to back orders and all of the challenges have just, really kind of gone out of the basement in the silo of supply chain. And all of the departments that are impacted by the disruption are becoming much more aware. But does that mean that they truly understand the function of supply chain, even as you're gaining, organizational awareness, and especially with leadership? So, Matt, I'm really excited to have you on the show today with Hayes and I. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So, Matt, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background and even how you wound up founding your company?
Sure. So I started in finance about 30 years ago, focused mainly on decision supports, trying to solve the problem around identifying supply costs. I got lucky enough to be brought into a large not-for-profit healthcare system focused in supply chain, and we had tons of resources. So implemented ERP systems, transaction systems, EMRs, and at the same time getting exposed to how to develop a supply chain that was the tip of the spear for the organization, turning it from a holding company to an operational company, So in doing this, got exposed to multiple ways of supply chain, how it works. A little over 5 years ago, I left that company to found my own consulting firm, trying to apply what I learned over the last 27 years of supply chain experience to other hospitals. So it's been an evolution and a journey for myself. I've learned as much as I've had a chance to impart, but for sure, it's been a good experience.
Well, one of the things that we talked about just as we were preparing for this interview, probably a month back or so, a lot of people say, oh, we've got to get back to the basics. We've got to get back to the basics. And there's a lot of people out there that have a lot of new blood that are joining their supply chain organizations, and they're trying to figure out, how do I mentor them? How do I give them the basics? And at the same time, keep running during these workforce shortages and bring them up to speed quickly enough. At the same time that, technology adoption's at a much faster rate than it ever has been. And so we're also getting propelled into the future, and also the evolution of just the structure of supply chain with strategic sourcing and value analysis. And so even the processes that we have are much more complicated, and those bigger picture visions tend to carry us forward, but it also can distance us from the basics. And so I wanted to just get your take, because you said, I say this all the time about making sure that the foundation is there and getting back to the basics, but that could mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. What do you mean when you say getting back to the basics?
Sure. So coming from the voice of a former finance person, I think over the last 10 years and probably longer, we have shifted our focus in supply chain to that of finance. So finance meaning, what are you saving me? What's it cost? Very wrapped up in the financial side of the business. So you see people who specialize in contracting or strategic sourcing becoming the leaders of organizations. But the reality comes back to that fundamental piece of, you can write a contract, but if you don't operationally implement it and you don't align the usage of that product appropriately, you don't actually achieve savings. It's just numbers on a piece of paper. And a lot of times we'll be asked to save money, but the reality is the saving money goes back to something we are estimating based upon historical spend. So engaging with that clinical operations side of the business, but also being able to still speak to the financial side and the other business operations side of the business becomes very important. So when I say the getting back to the basics, for me, it's leveraging the expertise and functionality of supply chain systems, as well as the aptitude of a financial leader to drive change, as well as lead and follow at the same time organizational improvements.
So is this a logistics thing, or is it more about the relationships piece, or is it simply utilization and understanding utilization? Really at its core, what do you think has been kind of missing that was so fundamental previously?
So yes, I think if I go back in time to the creation of ERPs, and ERP systems were created with really with finance, HR, all the other systems focused, and the supply chain module was essentially bolted on in every system that I'm aware of. And that bolt on essentially forced supply chain people to function in a way that matched the ERP system. And a lot of times they'll do their supply chain work in Excel, or they'll bolt on a system that is more of a transaction system to allow for them to be more effective in supply chain. But the reality is, when you do things like that, and technology forces you to change how you do your work, you forget how to do your work. You become less efficient at it. And I think going back to the basics and understanding how you do what you do, and then being able to explain what you do to the leadership team, is the key to it. So the answer is yes. It's the system. It's the process. It's the ability to take very basic end-to-end supply chain and interpret that in words and metrics that make sense to the clinical side of the business, the financial side of the business, without losing sight of the supply chain side of the business. So a great example of that is the conversation around fill rate. And I regularly hear people talking about, well, I've got to get my fill rate right. And when I sit down with somebody who's in the finance side of the business and say, well, your fill rate's at 95%, and I need to get you to 97%. We talk about, well, how are you going to do that? Right? So how do you achieve an improved fill rate? And when you start talking in terms of that change, you take it into terms of money. What is it going to cost for us to move from 95% to 97%? And that move is involved with money, because you have to increase your inventory, or you have to increase some form or fashion of how your inventory shows up so you can keep that fill rate high. If you're on the clinical side of the business, fill rate is a percentage of failure. It's 5% of the time you don't have what I need. So what does a clinician care about? They care about when they walk to the shelf and they look for something, they've got what they need to treat a patient. It's a conversation around stock out rate. So reflecting metrics that drive the business and what you do, that doesn't mean we ignore fill rate from our side of the business, nor do we not share it, but it's really about interpreting it in terms of stock out rate to the clinical side of the business, or sitting down with the CFO going, is the move from 95% to 97% going to make a difference in the organization such that it offsets the cost of what we have to do to achieve it? So oftentimes we create KPIs that don't align with what we're actually trying to achieve. Hence, always in the converse. And this is understanding your end-to-end supply chain. The reality is end-to-end supply chain metrics, you can probably encapsulate them in 10 to 12 metrics and maybe less. Knowing those metrics and how to interpret those metrics to the end user is the key. Sitting down and explaining to your clinical leader how a metric affects what they do in a way that they can apply to what they do on a day-to-day basis is 100% a win. Justin, you're a clinician by trade. Sitting down and talking to you about what something costs has no impact on whether you're delivering care to a patient a certain way. You might have it beat into you from the finances of the organization, but the reality is your number one focus is the patient.
Yeah. No, you're 100% right about that. I was even thinking we had another conversation during this season, and we were talking a lot about, just the fact that the ERP is often not connected to the EMR. So you already have kind of like this fundamental disconnect in communication between the finance side of the house and the clinical side of the house. But there is this other piece where a lot of the technology advancements that have been made, like you said, if they've got that finance focus, they've also kind of just fundamentally, without anybody doing it intentionally, distanced the clinical teams and the finance/supply chain teams and created a bigger gap. And you talk to physicians, and they'll say all the time, like, only bring me the data I need. Those financial systems don't always even bring the kinds of operational data back to a surgeon where they might say, wait a second, we're way more aligned than I thought we were on this. And so I can really see that what you're describing is a fundamental sort of shift that was in a positive direction that had some secondary side effects to further distance the clinical teams from the supply chain, because the primary focus is having what you need when you need it to deliver patient care. Because ethically, speaking as a clinician myself, not being able to do the best job for somebody who I'm standing right in front of in any capacity is definitely going to put you at an internal conflict about, trying to provide for care and why you got into the clinical setting to begin with.
And the financial mindset, entirely positive, because that's what we're trying to achieve. But if you think about it from a clinical side, and I am not a clinician, but it drives you to the mentality that everything is a widget, meaning it's interchangeable. I'll give you a couple examples of IV catheters. An IV catheter is not an IV catheter. It's complex as an orthopedic implant, if you want to take it to that level of complexity. Chest tubes. One chest tube is not the same as another chest tube. The function may be the same. And up on paper, as a supply chain person, say I'm going to switch one for the other. But the clinician's impact of that is education. What do I do and how do I learn this? And if you introduce multiple types of chest tubes, IV catheters, central lines to a hospital, and you don't have a training behind it, you're going to start having serious quality issues. And in addition to a frustrated clinical team. But the financials of it may say, you're saving money because you're driving widget for widget substitution, a widget for widget better pricing, or insert here.
Matthew, you just brought up a good point. Obviously, we bring in new people in supply chain every year, and they might know by the books. They know some of the PARs, PAR numbers and those type of things. But when you get down to what you just said, some products are not the same, even though they say they're the same. A chest tube is not a chest tube, or a hip implant's not. But how do you bring that new guy or gal in and kind of teach them some of those things? Because that's talking about the basics, right? Because if they're trying to create their sourcing, their contracting, their whatever they're doing, value analysis obviously plays a role in this, but trying to get them truly educated seems to me that's a hurdle.
It is, but it comes with mentality. Starting your supply chain leader off on the right spot, understanding that who we serve. We're a service-based profession, as is IT, but we're a service-based profession, and linking up and partnering with our upstream and downstream customers is key. I'll flip it. If you were an IT leader and you went forward and decided you were going to put a system in, but you did not ask the experts and you just put it in, your success in that implementation moved from being an implementation to installation. And an installation was a fail. And that happens across healthcare. The same happens with supply chain. If you don't spend the effort, and that's what value analysis comes in, strategic sourcing, in aligning your clinical resources, and they appreciate being aligned with you, creating that dialogue, encouraging transparency, and then setting up metrics and mechanisms to really track the success and align with the success that achieves that sustainability and actually brings your clinicians closer to you. They want to participate. They will call you with ideas. They do understand that there's a financial piece behind it. They don't want to focus on it. They want you to tell them things that are going to help them move their patient care, quality scores, overall patient experience better, make it better, excuse me.
So what do you think it is that the C-level executives and department leaders do understand better about supply chain? You know, I feel like, yeah, there's like this disconnect and there's the evolution of supply chain that's necessary. And we talked about a lot of that awareness being increased. So what do you think has resonated well since the pandemic and the increased sort of more broad awareness of healthcare supply chain within healthcare organizations?
So I think when COVID occurred, many supply chain leaders were tapped, begin to explain global supply chain to the C-suite. And I think pieces of it resonated. As we have moved out of the pandemic and product has become more available, then now substitutions have become a problem. And then obviously revenue challenges and expense challenges have shifted. But they go back to the interest in making them aware of what is happening, keeping them informed at a high level, but not burying them in metrics that they do not feel bring them value and achieve what they're trying to achieve as an organizational goal, right? I think you need to come to them with a very small subset of what is going to be pertinent to what they're doing. But I think we, as supply chain leaders, like to espouse upon all the things that we know. We talk about, as an example, there's a war in Ukraine and aluminum and magnesium is shortage, and we take them down this path. And candidly, it's this glaze over like, okay, so what does that mean? What does that mean for me? Okay, we better go buy this. Got it. Go do it. Don't talk to me about it anymore. And I think
you almost have to tell them the conclusion of the book, the final chapter, before you start telling them, you know, what all happened during the story to lead up to that, and sort of give them the bottom line and let them ask the why questions and then explain to them versus trying to walk them through it sort of like logically from beginning to end, right?
Yeah, I tell supply chain leaders I mentor regularly the same thing. Build credibility with consistency, showing up the same way. You do not create diatribes or long written essays on things. Create bullet point responses that summarize what's the issue, what you're trying to accomplish, and what the long-term answer is, and then make it clear and move forward. They will trust you to be successful. If they don't trust you, then they'll ask for more details, and then you can build that trust. But don't start off trying to show how much you know. That's why they hired you. And really, that's what a supply chain professional is. We should be the people who understand when you have an incident in Malaysia that we're going to have a problem with gloves. You have to understand how supply chain is affected at your local level from a global level. That's us. That's not the C-suite. And I shouldn't say that's not the CEO, COO, CNO, CQO, or CFO. Right? That's our job, either as a chief supply chain officer or supply chain leader. So that's where our profession needs to kick in. That doesn't mean we don't have that in our back pocket and can speak to it. But after a couple of times of speaking to it, they're not going to ask you anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll throw this in there. At our CEO meetings we have, one of the questions we typically ask is to a group of CEOs when we do this is, what part of the organization do you wish you knew more about? And typically the number one answer, it's one or two is tied, is revenue cycle IT. That's typically the number one thing they say. Second after that or B, you know, or in third would be supply chain. And that's throwing out clinical. They're not, they don't even pretend to know. I mean, no one really should say that if you're not, you know, but they're just saying parts of the hospital that, you know, typically they have an understanding, but not to your depth. And I think that's what you're saying, right? Is that you've got to give them kind of the cliff notes. You don't have to get down in the weeds, but they're hiring you because they think you know it a lot better than them. And so I think that's kind of what you're saying, right?
It is. And it goes back to what I was starting with, is understanding your end-to-end metrics, creating a way of communicating to them that is consistent, gives them information to understand your status without killing them with information or teaching them your profession. It's just like going in and sitting with the CFO. You don't want to understand how to diagnose a balance sheet and financial statements and dig into every one of the P&Ls. You really want to know a high-level answer and where to go. I think we need to focus as a supply chain on what we do well and what we understand. We are a linear profession. we start a cycle count. We come to a replenishment cycle. We do our P2P process. We get our products in and receive them. We replenish the inventory. And over top of all that, we have a contracting life cycle. And it's really that simple. And there, yes, you could say there's logistics and there's warehousing. Yes, but at the fundamental level, that is what we do. And maximizing what we know and sharing what we know with people who are our customers. And I view the C-suite as our customers and our clinicians and our ops people, with what we do in a way that they can interpret is the key. And that's what, when we go back to basics, that's really the piece. Go back to the basics of what we do. Talk about what we do in a way that's interpretable, and don't go down the path of every shiny object. The other thing I'll say is not every supply chain is made the same. I think sometimes we hear about distribution centers and every hospital wants one. I would challenge you that not every hospital needs one. Not every hospital needs logistics. Not every hospital needs the complexity we put in some larger systems, and some larger systems may not need them. So I think stay true to what we do. And by doing that, we become more valuable to the organization strategically and tactically.
Where do you think the confusion still lies? Is again, we've got kind of the attention a little bit, and you're talking about bullet points and giving them, really what they need to know, not all of the underlying information, right? If you're a good leader and the results are there, you're not going to have to spend a lot of time educating them, because they're not trying to function in a supply chain role. They're trying to support you. And I think sometimes that's why that explanatory scenario comes up is, and it often does come up when you don't really get a sense of that sort of servant leadership approach, right? When you realize that the CEO is there to help you, and you start telling them what you need and ask for the things, right? And then let them ask for the why, because sometimes they'll just say yes, okay. And you've kind of gotten there when you've proven yourself and built that trust and competence like you're talking about, right, Matt? But I think there are still some areas where I think it would help them to know, leadership and departments, help them to know certain things that may be a little bit more difficult for them to understand, or could just be an oversimplification of supply chain going on in their mind. Where should we be targeting some awareness without, maybe some of those long diatribes like you're talking about?
Sure. So I regularly say two quotes, and one I stole from a gentleman by the name of Vance Moore, who I highly regard. Be constructively dissatisfied. And the other is transparency drives grace and organizational alignment. And I believe in those two things. And I go back to that. So I think from what I've seen and what I've done, sharing what the supply chain process is at a high level is valuable. So they understand that we have a certain number of steps that we go through. And the other is regularly creating expectations document for each one of the people you interact with, so they know what to expect from your supply chain. So once you build that, the grace occurs. I think from my perspective, that's the level of complexity you want to share. And you support that again with metrics, right? You support those pieces and those fundamental steps with things that you can say, and this is how you know we're doing well, or this is how you know we're not doing well. I saw a metrics report once that had 100 metrics on it. And when I looked at it, it was like looking at a airplane dashboard. And there were so many switches that I was going, I don't know how this went up and this went down. They don't correlate to me. They were so complex. And if you sat down even with the person creating the metrics, even they got a little confused, like, okay, so maybe we need to take it back. And that go back to the 10 metrics. People can't consume more than that. You create that as your baseline. It explains the process. You make people understand it and establish the level of complexity you're willing to go. But being an expert in understanding what those things say when you talk to people will help them absorb and be more advocates for what you do. Did I answer your question, Justin?
Yeah. And so those 10 metrics that's an individual thing for every organization, because those are the levers that drive whatever it is that they're trying to do as a bottom line, right? They're the KPIs. But, a lot of times I think people look at it as, patient outcomes, or maybe there's 3 different KPIs that you're watching, but there's 10 levers that have the most influence over those 3 KPIs. And so I think a lot of what you're saying is you need to educate your organization a lot less on what they misunderstand about supply chain and more about what they might not understand about their own organization's supply chain and how the supply chain is measuring itself. Because if there's something that's missing, maybe you got to tweak those 10 levers and those 3 KPIs to more accurately reflect these departments that you're engaging with, that you're trying to help shape, the most efficient and highest quality delivery of care. So I think with that, in some of those conversations, there's probably some assumptions that a lot of people make in supply chain when they're reaching out, right? I'm going to throw one in, and I'm definitely going to throw in the one of, the surgeons don't care, right? And I think that can often be, and maybe that's more of an old school one. That might not be the case anymore. Actually just spoke to an organization the other day who created a medical director of supply chain position for one of their orthopedic surgeons. Absolutely transformative, I think, in the way that they viewed, clinician engagement. But the story goes that the physician leader reached out right as the supply chain leader was starting their job, didn't realize they were new, and had a laundry list of things that he felt like needed to be addressed and improved upon. And then they just started working together, and the physician found that he found supply chain to be extremely interesting. And flash forward to, 8 years later, the chief medical officer says, hey, you got to kind of focus on what you want to do now. You're spread into all these areas. You've got kind of an entrepreneurial nature, but we want you to focus on something that you're passionate about, that you can really dig into and just have a completely different level of effect on the organization. And so they created this medical director position in supply chain. But I think that happens a lot. People go to reach out to the physicians, and just based on the response, and I think a lot of it has to do with the time pressures physicians are under, we often assume they don't care. But that's not quite right, is it, Matt?
No. And the problem with working with physicians is if you talk to one, you talk to one. It's trying to move a sea of people who may or may not be aligned themselves, or they have certain relationships that they are unwilling to. They have two competing doctors and they don't want to get along, so they're going to pick different paths. It doesn't always work out that way, but I do think having someone who has a strong physician I'd say strong clinical background as an ally, whether they have a role formally or not, is important, again, to drive these changes, because change is difficult. But again, them understanding metrics will help you be successful. And I want to make one more comment about metrics, and I want to this is not the whole purpose of the dialogue, obviously, but make sure whatever you do use as a metric is something that you know how you can change. To grab a metric that you can't move is not value added. And I think a lot of times we grab metrics because they sound really cool and we put them out there. But the reality is there's no action you're going to take that's going to make them better or worse. They're just a number that is static, and maybe is static for months or years. Again, be thoughtful of what your change is and make sure you can explain, this is what the metric tells me. This is how it moves. And these are the levers that drive it. And here's how it ties, by the way, to the organization all the way through. So, but back to physicians, I found physicians to be very scientific in their thought processes. I think if you use information when you talk to them and don't try to throw things down their throats, in part that you may have some type of knowledge that you don't, I think is good. I don't want to get into an orthopedic conversation with an orthopod talking about why I think one type of knee is better than another, or, is there I don't want to encumber them with that.
All right. So with that in mind, I feel like, communication is a big thing, especially with the time pressures. So I think really knowing your audience, having worked in sales after having been a clinician, that was something I really had to learn a lot. My audience as a clinician was always the patient or a colleague clinician. I very rarely was talking to people who didn't have the same sort of baseline of knowledge. But in supply chain, you're talking to tons of people who are throughout the organization with all kinds of different frames of reference. And so, how do we make sure as supply chain leaders that we are communicating the best way possible with our internal partners, also understanding the pressures on our own time and the pressures on their time?
So time is the great culprit here. But what I would say is something I again try to talk or impart onto leaders as they develop, and that is, being a doer is great. Being an executor is better. So to execute, you have to establish some goal of sustainability. And that isn't with everything. So to do that, you actually have to be mindful of what you're communicating, how you're communicating, and the change aspects of what you're communicating. And I just go back to, think about who you're talking to. Talk to them. Engage with them. Will it take longer? It could, but the question becomes how many times do you want to do the same thing? So if you go down the path and doing it right the first time, and not everything has to be a Six Sigma project. So let me start off by saying that I think the little extra communication you can do will bring people in and buy you grace in addition to allow you to be more effective and create sustainability in the work that you do. And that's with everything. Problems, that's with large projects, that's with initiatives, it's everything.
Do you want to add anything, Hayes?
I mean, dude, no, I can't add anything to that.
Well, I
That was
like
good.
this one you put in the chat. Like, what are the top metrics?
Yeah.
I didn't know if you wanted to throw that in.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you could. My worry about throwing that out there, you talked about there might be 10 metrics, but could you come up with 10 metrics off the top of your head? That's what I didn't want to put you on the back, and you go, I can get 3 or 4. I didn't want to put you on the.
I think it's so yes, you could come up and it's funny. I'm writing a paper now about the organizational the life cycle of supply chain and how metrics tie into that. Because to your point, in the evolution of where supply chains are, metrics are different. And how automated you are, metrics are different. So I don't want to give that out because I don't want an organization of 150 beds to go and say, I need to use this metric. And the reality is it does nothing for them. They don't know how to move it. And it doesn't reflect anything for them. Yet I give another metric that's very basic. Yet you take it to a Trinity-sized hospital and they're like, this is useless. It doesn't reflect what we do. So I think this is where I would look at ARM. And as well as publications, which again, I'm sure many of us who are doing these, but there's people out there who can help spell out these metrics who just really want supply chain to be better. And I would say look internally, look at your own metrics, your own ERP system, what data you have access to, and ask yourself the question, what are the things we should track and understand? And I think that'll get you there. The other thing I want to throw out, and I don't want to kick us off into another session, but it's something to think about. And I regularly challenge any leader I run into, and that is think a little bit outside the box. I think sometimes we get into situations and we're in there, we're solving, and we don't take a step back and ask ourselves the question, there's some functionality or some tool or some way of doing this that we've not thought about doing that we should be challenging ourselves with and be a little more innovative in how we serve the customer and achieve outcomes that are positive in favor to the organization and our own department.
Matt, phenomenal interview today. You did really a wonderful job. You're a natural at this, so I recommend you get on more podcasts because
I would agree.
I think you did a phenomenal job. Can't thank you enough for coming on today and sharing your insights.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for taking the time. It was a pleasure meeting you both.
That was Matt Mentel, founder and strategic partner at Strategic Optimization and Innovation Partners, LLC. Just talking about how to ensure your stakeholders and leadership fully understand supply chain's role. And I loved not only the back to the basics, Hayes, but how he painted a picture for really tailoring and customizing your supply chain strategy and metrics around your specific organization. What resources do you have? What's the size of your organization? And, what matters most to your organization and really aligning around that. Really great job today. Matt clearly has done some exceptional things.
No question. He's an expert at it. And it was, to your point there, Justin, like a group of metrics for one hospital will not work and will not play at another one. He really did a good job of kind of painting that picture. So great job, Matt. I enjoyed it and learned a lot.
Thanks a lot, Matt, for joining us today. And on behalf of Hayes, Gary, who's not here with us today, myself, thank you for listening to this episode of Power Supply.
Boom!
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on your iPhone or Android. Simply search for Power Supply in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@powersupplymedia.net. We look forward to hearing from you.